Have you ever stood at the edge of silence and felt it stare back? Not the silence of an empty room, but something deeper, older. The hush that lingers where the world once wept and no one dared to write it down. In our bright cities, in our scrolling feeds, we forget. We forget that not long ago, every sunrise had a price. Every victory, every harvest, every heartbeat, paid for in blood. Tonight, we leave that comfort behind. We descend into jungles that breathe like beasts, into ruins where stone remembers what men forgot, into fires that once burned not just wood, but belief. 15 rituals, 15 doors, each one carved in suffering, each one leading deeper into the forgotten chambers of the human soul. This is not a story about ancient horror. It is a journey into the shape of devotion, into the echo of cries offered to gods who no longer answer. Or perhaps never did. You are not just watching. You are walking with me. Torchlight in hand, breath tight in your chest. We go together, past the veil, past the myth, to where history still bleeds beneath the soil. You have felt the pull. Now follow it. The expedition begins. The dust still clung to my boots when I reached the edge of what was once Tenochtitlan. Jagged temples rose like obsidian teeth against the dawn. The city was long gone, but the stones still hummed, as if remembering. I had come searching for fragments of ceremony. But what I found was something far older than any empire. Older even than the pyramids that pierced the sky. It was a circle, carved into the basalt. A ring scorched black by centuries of ritual flame. This was where they danced. Not for joy, but for survival. For the Aztecs believed the sun itself had died before, and could die again. They called them the Tonatia, sun eaters, priests chosen by fate to bleed for the heavens. Their bodies painted with ash, their hearts steady with purpose. At dusk, the procession began. Drums pounded like thunder over a dry lake. The dancers leapt barefoot into fire, their steps a rhythm older than language. They moved through smoke as if possessed. Every footfall a prayer, every spin a sacrifice of breath. The ritual was not just spectacle. It was a conversation with the cosmos. The gods, they believed, had once sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion. Now it was humanity's turn to return the favor. But there was more. As the flames rose, the chants shifted. No longer words, but wails. The dancers, still alight, would fall to their knees. Priests would step forward, obsidian blades in hand, and from each chosen heart, the sun would drink. The stone at the center of the circle was dark with it. Centuries of blood absorbed into volcanic stone. It smelled of copper and smoke. It was not a myth. Some say the victims were enemies, prisoners of war. But the truth is more complex. Many offered themselves, not out of fear, but duty. To die for the sun was to become a god, if only for a breath. When the Spanish arrived, they saw only cruelty. They burned the codices, shattered the temples, ended the rites. But they could not unmake the belief. The people still whispered to the sunrise, still left offerings of maize and tears. Even now, high in the Sierra, the fire dances returned during eclipses. I stood in the circle long after the sun had climbed above the ruins. The wind carried the scent of charred sage, and I imagined the final moment. A body, broken by devotion, raised to the heavens, and the sun, reluctant, rising once more. Was it horror or something deeper? The line between sacrifice and salvation is thinner than we like to admit. They gave to the flame, not out of madness, but belief. And belief, when desperate, makes us do beautiful and terrible things. I brushed ash from the carvings and closed my journal. The stones had spoken, and I had listened. But still, the question lingered. If the sun began to falter today, would we have the faith to bleed for its return? The wind never stops on the steppe. It howls across the grasses like an ancient lament, carrying dust and memory. I had followed a crude map, hand-drawn by a Soviet archaeologist whose notes were smuggled out decades ago. It led me to a low rise in the middle of nowhere. No ruins, no stones, only earth. But the ground felt wrong. Soft, uneasy beneath the boots. We dug, and what we found was not a tomb. It was a theater of death, a kurgan, a burial mound. Used by the Scythians, the nomadic horse lords who ruled the steppes long before history carved borders across them. Inside, wrapped in furs and gold, lay a warrior king, tall even in death, his arms still adorned with jewelry. But it was not the king that haunted me. It was who came with him. Around the body were others, laid in precise arrangements. Women, servants, guards. Their bones told the story. Some had their skulls crushed, others clean cuts to the neck. They had not died by disease or age. They had died in service, murdered to follow their king into the afterlife. In the far corner, we found a horse, its legs tucked, its eyes gone for millennia, but still regal. The Scythians believed no ruler should travel alone in death. His court, his animals, his comforts, all were brought with him, by force if needed. And this was not an isolated case. Across the Eurasian plains, dozens of kurgans tell the same story. Kings who built their eternity on the backs of those who could not refuse. Historians debate whether the sacrifices were voluntary. Perhaps some were, but the execution marks, the broken jaws, the binding ropes, they speak a different truth. As I examined the skeletons, I noticed something strange. One woman's hand still grasped a pendant, made of bronze, etched with what looked like an eagle, perhaps a gift, or a final act of resistance. She had not let go, even in death. The more I saw, the more uneasy I became. These were not just tombs. They were monuments to a brutal order, where the elite carved their power into the bones of the voiceless. Yet, even in the darkness, there is nuance. To the Scythians, this was not murder. It was loyalty, continuity. To die for one's lord was to serve in eternity, a belief that erased the boundary between reverence and cruelty. The wind picked up as we closed the mound. The grasses swayed like they were bowing. I stood there for a long time, trying to picture the final hour, the torches, the chants, the moment the blade fell, and whether those eyes were filled with devotion or despair. Sometimes history whispers from golden thrones, but more often it cries from unmarked graves. The burial of the slave kings was not just a ritual, it was a truth. One buried, not forgotten. I left a stone at the edge of the kurgan, a silent marker, not for the king, but for the ones who had no names and no choice. The earth reclaimed them, but their story endures, etched not in marble, but in the silence they left behind. The marble streets of Rome were quiet when I arrived. The ruins cast long shadows, each one shaped by 1,000 years of memory. Beneath the grandeur, beneath the columns and domes, there was something older, something colder. They still speak of it in fragments. Of Saturn, not the planet, the god, the one who ruled before Jupiter, before order, before time was gentle. His was a reign of fear and famine. He devoured his children to keep his throne. A tale told in myth, yes. But Rome, the real Rome, remembered. And once a year, they fed him. They called it Saturnalia, the festival of reversal. When the world turned upside down, Slaves were crowned as kings. Masters served their servants. The streets pulsed with laughter and chaos. Masks hid faces. Gifts were exchanged in the spirit of false joy. But beneath the revelry, something darker moved. In the temple of Saturn, deep in the forum, the chains that bound his statue were unfastened. Symbolically, they said. But symbols have power. Offerings were made. Grain, wine, coins. And in secret corners, something more. Something that has no place in the textbooks. Historians still argue whether blood was spilled. If sacrifices of life accompanied the festival, there are records that hint. Seneca wrote of children born during Saturnalia, unwanted, disposed of. Some claimed it was part of the offering. That Saturn required what he once gave, life, taken in its infancy. Others whispered of gladiators, forced to fight during the feast, not for justice, not for Rome, but for him, to echo the primal hunger he embodied. And when they fell, their blood was swept toward the altars. In one excavation, beneath the temple itself, we found a pit, shallow, charred, and in it, fragments of bone, too small for livestock. The carbon dating placed them near the peak of Saturnalia's observance. Coincidence, perhaps. But the Romans did not do things by accident. Even their chaos was ritualized, sanctioned, wrapped in pageantry. It was about control. By letting go for a week, they claimed to purge their darkest urges, to honor the old ways without becoming them. But sometimes, I wonder, did they enjoy the reversal too much? Did the mask slip too easily? Did Saturn, bound in stone for the rest of the year, smile when he was unchained? Walking through the forum, I touched the cold pedestal where his statue once stood. It was smooth, worn by time and reverence. But it still held weight. You could feel it in your chest. Like the pressure before a storm, there is a difference between forgetting and burying. Rome buried Saturn, but never truly let him go. Even now, remnants of Saturnalia survive. The lights of December, the feasts, the gift-giving, echoes of a time when the world turned wild. And though we laugh now, decorating trees and singing carols, the roots run deep, down to a god who ate his own future, who ruled before light, who demands remembrance. Not through worship, but through fear. I stepped away from the ruins, my breath hanging in the winter air. Saturn had been fed, not with blood perhaps, but with memory. And sometimes, memory is the most enduring sacrifice of all. The lake shimmered beneath a pale mist, still, silent, its surface untouched by wind. They called it the Mirror of the Moon, Lake Nemi, cradled in the Alban Hills just outside of Rome. But the reflection hides something older than water, a forest, dense, sacred, feared. I entered just after dawn. The canopy held the light like a secret. Birdsong faded as I moved deeper, and then I saw it. A tree, thick and gnarled, its bark cut in a perfect line, blood-red resin weeping from the wound. It looked like it had been struck by steel. Recently, this was no ordinary grove. This was the domain of Diana, huntress, moon goddess, protector of the wild. And for centuries, her priest was the most hunted man in the empire. They called him the Rex Nemorensis, the king of the woods. But his crown was cursed. He held his power by one law. Only he who killed the king could become the king. It was a ritual without ceremony. No audience, no altar, only a blade and a chase. To claim the throne, a challenger had to break a branch from a sacred tree. That alone was a death sentence. The reigning priest would hunt them, through the trees, through the fog, until one stood victorious. The kingship was a cycle of violence, sanctioned by divinity. No king died of age. No king retired. They bled into the soil. We found evidence in the roots. Bones, rusty blades, ornaments carved with lunar symbols, many of them buried in shallow graves. Quick interments, not with reverence, but necessity. The Roman writers were fascinated and horrified. Ovid, Strabo, Suetonius. They wrote of the bleeding groves, of fugitives who sought power through murder. Some say even emperors came here in secret, to watch, to whisper, to remember what it meant to kill for divinity. But the forest remembers more than stories. Locals still say the trees scream when the wind rises, that birds refuse to nest too near the sacred glade, that sometimes a stranger appears in the woods and never returns. As I stood among the trees, I found a stone altar, moss-covered, split down the center. A single coin rested on top, recent, an offering, or a warning. I thought about the last king, whoever he was, how he must have lived, looking over his shoulder, listening for footsteps in the leaves, knowing that death was not an if, but a when. The bleeding trees do not lie. Each scar, each gouge is a record of power, of fear, of the price of divinity. The cult of Diana has long since vanished. Or perhaps it has simply changed names. But in Nemi, you feel it. A presence, a breath in the stillness. This was not ritual as pageantry. It was ritual as law, as survival. As the raw edge of belief, I left the forest quietly. Not out of fear, but respect for whatever still walks there. History may forget the names, but the trees remember the blood. And the throne of Nemi, though long vacant, is never truly empty. The air in Anyang was heavy with stillness, not silence, but a quiet that pressed inward, as if the earth itself remembered. I walked along what once was the Shang capital, now just low walls and sun-baked dust. But below the surface, something waited. We found them buried beneath ancient courtyards, shells, bones, cracked deliberately, smoothed by fire, inscribed with the earliest Chinese script known to us. Oracle bones. They were not meant to be read by scholars. They were meant to be heard by spirits. The Shang believed their ancestors never truly left. They lingered, powerful, present, capable of guiding or cursing the living. So the priests asked them questions, carved into the shoulder blades of oxen, or the plastrons of turtles. Simple questions at first. Will the harvest fail? Will the rains come? Should we go to war? Then came fire. They would heat a bronze rod and press it to the bone until it cracked. The shape of the crack held the answer. Straight meant yes. Curved meant no. More complex fractures meant more complex truths. But fire alone did not speak. The spirits demanded blood. The bones found in Anyang were often buried with the remains of animals. Dogs, boars, birds. But sometimes, buried deeper, we found human remains. Arms bound, skulls pierced. Not prisoners, not enemies, but ritual victims. Their deaths timed to coincide with the divinations, so the ancestors would listen more closely. One set of bones bore a chilling inscription. Will the child's spirit bring favor? The crack ran straight through, and beside it, a tiny jawbone, no older than 5. The power behind the Shang throne was not just in bronze. It was in belief, in the sacred knowledge of the priests. Who could read the voices of the dead? They wielded it carefully, or so the records say. But how much power is ever truly safe? Among the bone fragments we found evidence of repeated burning, not for answers, but to quiet dissent. Some bones bore curse marks, accusations carved into them, names condemned by fire. The oracle became a weapon, and in time, the Shang fell, replaced by the Joe, who claimed the mandate of heaven had passed, that the ancestors had turned their backs on the blood-soaked rites, but even they continued the rituals, with more restraint, or more secrecy. As I knelt beside a broken plastron, its cracks blackened by age, I tried to hear what they had once heard. Not just the voices of the dead, but the desperation of the living, who lit fires and spilled blood in hopes that someone, anyone, was listening. The oracle bones are silent now. Their messages catalogued, studied, reduced to data, but they were never meant for us. They were moments of terror, of decision, of pleading with a world just beyond the veil. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what would we burn? What would we sacrifice? To hear the future speak. The stone steps were slick from rain. Or was it something older? The temple ruins of Tlaxcala rose before me, silent now, but once they echoed with chants, drums, and the sound of skin being peeled from bone. This was the home of Xipe Totec, the flayed one, god of spring, of renewal, of suffering transformed into life. His priests believed that for the earth to bloom again, it must be clothed in pain. Just as a snake sheds its skin, so must man offer his. They chose their victims with precision, prisoners taken in ritual battle. Strong, beautiful, worthy of transformation. They were paraded through the streets, fed, dressed in finery, given days to live as gods. Before being tied to the stone, then the blade came, obsidian, sharper than steel, and the skin was removed in one careful ritual. Not hacked, but peeled as a garment, to be worn. Yes, worn. The priests would take the flayed skins and drape them over their own bodies. Still warm, still wet, they walked through the city like resurrected gods, the masks of their victims stitched over their faces, breathing through the mouths of the dead. They wore them for days, until the flesh dried, cracked, fell away like bark from a tree. This was the festival of Tlaquisipi-Willistli, the shedding of men. To the Aztecs, this was not horror, it was hope. The crops needed the sacrifice. The cycle of death and rebirth was sacred. The blood that spilled was not waste, it was seed. We found fragments of skin in clay jars, carefully preserved. We found statues of Xipe Totec with 2 layers of eyes. One his, one belonging to the mask he wore. They believed the god had flayed himself to give food to mankind. And so, his priests followed his example. They did not flinch. They did not blink. What startled me most was how normal it all seemed in the records. The calm description of the ceremonies, the order of events, as if it were just another harvest ritual, not the reenactment of a living death. I touched one of the remaining stone altars, its surface worn smooth by centuries of prayers. And blood. And I wondered how many had laid there, how many had given everything in the belief that their death would feed life. Some say the festival was about more than agriculture, that it was about power, about turning enemies into symbols, and symbols into tools. But others argue it was an act of empathy, to wear another's pain, to carry it on your shoulders, to become the suffering before becoming the spring. There are no more flayed priests in Tlaxcala, only bones and broken idols. And yet, as the wind moved through the temple stones, I felt something watching, not in malice, but in memory, because what they practiced was not madness, it was meaning, in its most raw and terrifying form. To become the god, one had to become the womb, and in doing so, they believed the world would heal. The bog was still, brown water lapping gently against reeds. A mirror without sky. Just mud, mist, and the faint smell of peat and decay. I was in the lowlands of Ireland. Kells to the north, Dublin too far to matter. This place was old before either had a name. It was here the earth swallowed its chosen. They call them bog bodies now, perfectly preserved by time and tannin. Men and women pulled from the soil with skin like leather, hair still curled, flesh intact. But they were not buried by accident. They were placed, deliberately, sacrificed. One of them, Tolland man, was found with a noose still around his neck, his eyes closed, his mouth soft, as if asleep. But the rope told a different story. Another had been stabbed, then hit in the head, then drowned. As if one death was not enough, the Celts believed the bog was a gate, a threshold between this world and the next. To give something precious to the waters was to send it beyond the veil, to the gods, to the spirits that governed rain, harvest, war. They offered animals, weapons, jewelry, but sometimes that was not enough. Sometimes they gave a person. The chosen were not always captives. Some were highborn, well-fed, manicured hands, clothed in robes dyed with rare color. Priests, perhaps, or kings, or queens who ruled for a single season, until the gods demanded their return. We found them curled in strange positions, knees tucked, hands bound, placed into the bogs like gifts wrapped in flesh, and the earth accepted. The peat closed over them. No grave markers, no stone, only silence. I stood at the edge of one such site, my boots sinking slightly into the wet moss. It was quiet, but not empty. The air carried something, a weight, a presence. You could almost hear it. A chant without words, a drum without rhythm, a question hanging in the mist. What would you give to make the rain fall? This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was ritual, it was belief. To appease unseen powers, one had to show devotion. And there was no devotion greater than a life given freely, or taken in fear. We found no temples, no altars, just water, and mud, and the bodies left behind. But that is enough. The bog itself was sacred, a temple without walls, a god that breathed through mist. And even now, thousands of years later, the land gives back what it was given. Finger by finger, tooth by tooth, the chosen are returning, and with them, the memory of a people who saw death not as punishment, but as currency, to trade for peace, for Sunday, for one more year of life. I looked down into the brown water, still, dark, and wondered, if I had lived then, would I have stood at the edge and watched someone I loved disappear into the depths and called it holy? The air in Mohenjo-Daro was thick with heat. Even in ruin, the stones still held the Sunday. It was not just temperature, it was memory. Every brick still warm with the breath of ceremony. I came looking for answers in the dust. But what I found were scorch marks. Ancient, etched into the heart of the city, footprints, burned into the clay. They led to a platform, square, precise, a ritual pit, flanked by steps and ringed with ash. The Vedas speak of fire, not as destruction, but as bridge, Agni, the god of flame, he who carries offerings to the heavens. To walk through fire was not punishment. It was purification, a test of truth, of purity, of devotion so deep that it burned away fear. They called it Agni Pariksha, the trial by flame, the firewalk, the step between worlds. In some legends, the goddess Sita walked through fire to prove her innocence. In others, sages crossed coals to receive divine visions. Their skin blistered, their feet bloodied, but they believed the pain was a passage. We found layers of charcoal beneath the old city, ashes sifted with fragments of bone, some animal, some human. And in the center, the remains of fire altars, shaped like lotuses, their petals blackened by time. The rituals were not for spectacle. They were sacred acts, performed at dawn, with chants that made the very dust vibrate. The priests would light the fire with mantras. No spark, only sound. They believed the flame must be invited, not forced. Those who walked were chosen, sometimes out of penance, sometimes to prove loyalty, and sometimes to invoke the gods. One inscription spoke of a festival where 7 walked the fire. Only 3 returned without mark. The others were carried away, burned, not punished, but accepted. In Vedic belief, pain was not the end. It was the beginning of knowledge. To burn was to be made clean, and yet, standing there, imagining the heat, the screams, the absolute silence after the last footstep, I could not help but wonder, where did faith end and fear begin? We often speak of ancient wisdom with awe. We forget how sharp it could be, how much it could cost. In some variations, the firewalk was a trial for brides, for the accused, for the dying, to prove purity, to gain favor, to die with meaning. In that pit, I found shards of painted pottery, offerings once placed near the flame, butter, rice, incense, and behind it all, the faintest outline of a footprint, still pressed into the clay. To walk fire was to surrender completely, to body, to God, to fate. Today, in some villages, the ritual still survives. Though the fires are smaller, the steps fewer, the meaning remains. A step into fire is not an act of bravery. It is an act of surrender, of becoming something more than flesh. As I left the ruins, the sun dipped low, its light turning the dust to gold, and I thought of those ancient souls, stepping barefoot into flame, eyes closed, hearts open, not to survive, but to be seen. The palace at Knossos is not a ruin. It is a riddle. Staircases that lead to nowhere. Doorways that open into walls. Hallways that curve until you forget where you began. I arrived just after sunrise. The sky behind the columns glowed red, like some warning long ignored. This was the heart of the Minoan world. Elegant, mysterious, alive with ceremony and myth. And beneath it all, a labyrinth. They say it was built to hold a monster, half man, half bull, the Minotaur. A creature so terrifying that a king had it hidden underground. But what if the truth was worse than the myth? The bones tell a different story. In the depths of Knossos, near a chamber lined with frescoes of bulls, we found them. Tiny bones, children. Their skulls showed signs of trauma, their ribs cracked in unnatural ways. Laid not in graves, but stacked, stored. The legend says Athens sent 7 boys and 7 girls to Crete each year. A tribute, a sacrifice, food for the beast. What if the beast was not a creature, but a ritual? Minoan culture worshipped the bull. The frescoes show acrobats leaping over massive animals. But this was no sport. It was sacred. It was sacrificed through spectacle. To leap the bull was to tempt death, to become divine if you survived, to be consumed by myth if you failed. Some scholars believe the labyrinth was never a prison. It was a temple, a place where blood sealed the seasons, where children were given not as punishment, but as gifts to something they no longer named. We found altars stained with ancient residue, bones of cattle, bones of humans, mixed, burned, hidden, It was not chaos. It was ritual. And the deeper you went, the colder the air became. The walls seemed to breathe. Or perhaps that was just my fear. In one chamber, a red spiral was painted across the stone, a symbol of infinity, or of being trapped forever. They believed the labyrinth had no center, that the journey itself was the offering, the fear, the disorientation, the slow surrender. Even Theseus, in the myth, needed a thread to escape. He found the Minotaur and killed it. But perhaps the real monster was never defeated, only buried. The Minoans vanished. Knossos fell silent. But the labyrinth endures. In dreams, in stories, in the quiet corners of the mind where logic unravels. As I stood in the ruins, I touched the stone walls. Cool. Unmoving. But beneath the surface, I felt a vibration. Not sound, but memory. We want our myths to stay myths. Safe, symbolic. But Knossos refuses. It reminds us that ritual is not always kind. That culture can be beautiful and brutal in the same breath. I turned away from the depths and stepped back into the light. But a part of me never left. Still walking the winding halls. Still searching for a center that may not exist. Because some mazes are not meant to be solved, only remembered. And some monsters wear the face of tradition and speak in the voice of gods. The sun bled orange over the ruins of Carthage. Sea wind carried salt and silence through shattered stone. And there, just beyond the temple walls, was the place they tried to forget. Tophet, a word that tastes like ash. A field of urns, a garden of grief. No statues, no plaques, only rows and rows of stone markers. We found them buried in careful lines, each one no larger than a child's arms. Inside, ash, bone, charred remnants no bigger than a hand. Some say they were stillborn, laid here out of sorrow. But the pattern told a different story. Thousands, not dozens, thousands of infant remains, many burned, some marked with inscriptions. To Baal-Hamon, to Tanit, to gods who watched without mercy. The ancients called it offering, a way to win favor, to stop famine, to bring rain, to gain victory in war. Give what is most precious, and the gods will answer. But the cost, the unbearable cost, was paid by the mothers. We found carvings of them, women in profile, arms raised, mouths open in frozen cries. But the stones could not speak, and the women who once stood here are long gone. Mute. The Greek and Roman writers condemned it, accused the Carthaginians of slaughtering their young, of choosing fire over family. But they were enemies. Their words carry poison. And yet, the ashes remain. One urn bore a pendant still fused to the bone. A tiny charm, perhaps placed by a hand shaking with doubt, or devotion, or both. What kind of belief demands this? What kind of fear makes you obey? Some scholars argue it was symbolic, that the fire was for funerals, not sacrifice, but the sheer number, the placement, the ritual, consistency. They tell a darker truth. This was not grief, it was offering. And the gods of Carthage listened. The city thrived for centuries. Its ships ruled the sea, its markets overflowed, its armies marched strong. But all things bought with blood eventually turn. When Rome came, it did not show mercy. It burned the city to the ground, salted the earth, erased the name. Perhaps the gods had grown tired, or perhaps they were never real. Only echoes of fear carved into stone. As I stood in Tophet, I felt no peace, only weight, the kind that presses on your ribs and makes it hard to breathe. Each urn was a question, each name a silence. Were they loved? Were they wept for? Did the mothers watch? Or were they led away before the flames were lit? And if belief demanded it, what choice did they have? Faith can lift, but it can also burn. I left a stone at the edge of the field, not as tribute, not as blessing, but as remembrance for the mute mothers who held their children one last time and placed them into fire, not because they wanted to, but because they believed they had to. And that, more than anything, is the cruelty of forgotten gods. The Nile winds quietly through the land of Goshen, a place where green meets gold, where the reeds whisper in languages older than empire. I came to Avaris, the once thriving capital of the Hyksos, foreign kings who ruled northern Egypt for a century. Their city now sleeps beneath layers of sand and silence. But in one courtyard, the silence was broken by what the ground gave back. A pit, rectangular, clean-edged, deliberately carved, and filled, not with treasure, not with bones of royalty, but with hands, severed, piled, hundreds of them, left hands only, each one carefully removed, some still wearing rings, most curled into a final gesture. We counted 14 separate deposits across the compound. Every pit told the same story. Hands stacked like tribute. It was not a mass grave. It was an offering. The inscriptions nearby confirmed it. A record of victory, a tally of enemy soldiers defeated, and proof. The hands. The general would present them to the pharaoh, or in this case, to the Hyksos king. Each hand a receipt, a body no longer living, a threat erased. But something was off. Some of the hands were too small, too smooth. The bones lacked the wear of labor. A few belonged to women, even children. Were they warriors or captives? The Egyptians believed in order. Ma'at, balance. But war frayed that balance. And in the chaos, rituals changed. Morality bent. Sacrifice became theater. This was not simple brutality. It was ceremonial. The severing had purpose. The hands were cleaned, arranged, placed with intention. To take a hand was to remove power, agency, honor, to disarm a person forever. And when done in public, it became a warning, a symbol, a message carved in flesh. Avaris was a city of contradiction, foreign rulers adopting Egyptian gods, nomads turned pharaohs, and in this contradiction, they built rituals that blurred the line between victory and vengeance. As I stood over the pit, the wind shifted, dry, carrying the scent of dust and history. It was not hard to picture the scene. A line of soldiers, carrying bags of hands, dropping them into the pit, counting each one, recording each name, as though this was bookkeeping, not butchery. The gods of Egypt watched, from carved walls and painted ceilings, and perhaps they turned their faces away. One hand caught my attention, larger than the others, heavily calloused, likely a warrior. It still wore a metal ring, bent, blackened by time. Someone loved this man once, or feared him, or both. And now, only this fragment remained. We often speak of monuments, of pyramids and temples, but Avaris reminds us that some monuments are buried, and made not of stone, but of flesh. This was a ritual, yes, but it was also a lesson about what power does when it is afraid. It cuts, it counts, and it forgets. But the earth does not forget, and neither should we. The jungle breathes in Guatemala. It exhales mist, heat, and the hum of insects that never sleep. Deep within it lies Tikal, a city swallowed by time, where temples rise like green-covered teeth from the forest floor. We came at dawn, before the canopy fully woke, and there, in a hidden chamber beneath the Temple of the Masks, we found them, rows of teeth filed to points, carved, ornamented with jade, embedded with hematite, polished like weapons. They belonged to priests, not kings, not warriors, but those who served something deeper. The gods who walked in shadow, the Jaguar priests. They did not speak for the gods. They became them. Their rites were not gentle. They cut, they bled, and they devoured. The Jaguar was not just an animal. It was the symbol of the underworld, of the night, Sunday, of power that stalked in silence. To serve it, one had to look like it, sound like it, bite like it. The modification began young. Children chosen for the path were given pain as initiation. Teeth filed by hand. No anesthetic, only will. And the sound of grinding stone. Some died from infection. Others lost their voices. But those who survived, they smiled like predators. In the rituals, they wore jaguar skins, draped over blood-red robes. They painted their faces with ash and ochre. And when the drums began, they transformed, not just in mind, in body. They crouched, growled, clawed the air with obsidian blades. They performed sacrifices not with detachment, but hunger, ripping hearts from chests, tearing flesh with filed teeth, consuming parts of the offering to blur the line between priest and beast. One burial site held the remains of such a priest, his mask still intact, carved from bone and shell. Jaguar fangs curled from the jaw. Beside him, tools of ritual, knives, feathers, human bones etched with calendar glyphs. They believed the world had been created and destroyed many times, and each cycle ended in blood. To delay the end, they had to feed the gods, regularly, violently. But the Jaguar priests were not feared. They were revered, guides through death, keepers of cosmic balance. The Maya calendar did not fear time. It embraced its ending, and the priests stood between that ending and the people. Their teeth were symbols of sacrifice, of strength, of silence. Even now, modern descendants of the Maya speak of jaguars with reverence. They appear in dreams, in omens, in moments of deep transition. I touched one of the jade inlays. It still shimmered, despite centuries buried in soil. And I wondered, what does it take to give up your humanity, piece by piece, for the promise of power, or protection, or purpose? We often sanitize the past, make it distant, tidy. But here, in the jungle, the past still growls, still watches, still waits. The Jaguar priests are gone, but their teeth remain as proof that once, to serve the divine, you had to become something no longer entirely human. Delphi sits on the slope of Mount Parnassus. Its stones glimmer in the morning haze, and the wind carries a hush. Not silence, but reverence. This was the navel of the world, the place where gods breathed through mortals, where kings and conquerors came seeking answers. And at the heart of it all, a girl, chosen young, made sacred, then broken. They called her the Pythia, the Oracle of Apollo. But she was not born holy. She was taken, taught, transformed. She was often no older than 16, a virgin, a vessel. Her body purified by ritual, her diet restricted, her life no longer her own. She sat upon a tripod. Above, a chasm in the earth. Fumes rose from the deep, sulfur, ethylene, or perhaps something divine. She inhaled and began to shake, Her mouth foamed, her eyes rolled, and from her lips came riddles. Not words she understood, but fragments, visions. A language spoken by the gods and interpreted by priests. Men, always men. They decided what her cries meant. They recorded the prophecies and shaped them to suit politics, or war, or faith. The people saw her as a miracle, but in truth, she suffered. Ancient texts hint at madness, at seizures, at fear. Some Pythias died young, others were replaced quietly, buried without fanfare. She was sacred only when useful, then forgotten. I stood in the temple ruins, where her voice once echoed. The floor still warm from Sunday, the columns fractured, but the weight remained. I closed my eyes and imagined the moment, a girl, alone, smoke rising around her, dozens waiting for her to speak, not as herself, but as Apollo. What if she wanted to run? What if her visions were not divine, but panic? What if the god she heard was her own scream, trapped beneath layers of expectation? We want to believe in prophecy, in chosen voices, but so often, the voices we raise are the ones we silence. Delphi prospered for centuries. The oracle guided the fate of empires. But when the gods fell silent, so did she. Christianity came, the temple was abandoned. The tripod vanished. The fumes stopped. Now, only stones remain, and stories, but those stories echo. In every girl told to be pure, to be quiet, to be holy, to speak only what others will interpret. In every system that crowns its oracles, then forgets their names. I found a carving near the sanctuary, a face, half erased, but the eyes endured, not divine, not possessed, just tired. We call her a prophet, but she was also a prisoner. And still, she spoke, not because she wanted power, but because the world demanded it, because belief is a weight, and she carried it, alone. The Pythia is gone, but the silence she left behind speaks louder than ever. The fire was long dead when I arrived, but the stones were still warm. Not from heat, but from memory, the kind that seeps into the soil and never leaves. This was once a pyre, a place of smoke and ash, and something else. Grief made into ritual. Love turned into law. They called it Sati, the ultimate devotion, the final duty of a widow, to die upon her husband's funeral fire, to burn while the chant still echoed. It did not begin with violence, not always. In the earliest Vedic texts, it is not commanded, it is rare, voluntary, a choice. But choices can become expectations, and expectations can become chains. By the medieval period, it had become tradition. In many places, sacred, respected, required. We found stone markers, carved with hands, palm prints pressed into history, symbols of women who had taken the flame. Some wore bangles. Some had names. Most had neither. Witness accounts describe the process. A wife, draped in red, surrounded by drummers, priests, relatives, sometimes honored, sometimes held down. They say she smiled, that she climbed the pyre without fear, that her soul ascended in light. But truth flickers, and fire burns everything it touches. Were they willing? Were they given time to grieve? Or were they told that to refuse was shame? That to live was weakness. One inscription read, "She was pure. She was faithful. She was flame." We found melted gold near one site. Necklaces, anklets, still fused to bits of bone. Not all women died silently. Records exist of resistance, of those who tried to escape, of villagers who intervened. of families torn between pride and mourning. The Mughal rulers tried to stop it. So did the British. But outlawing a belief does not end it. It hides it, buries it, until the heat fades, and it begins again. Even into the 19th century, it continued. Hidden, justified, rationalized. A widow without a husband was seen as incomplete. Her life viewed through his death, and Sati became the answer. Not for her, but for the community. I stood beside a carved stone pillar, a Sati stone, weathered by time, its edges softened, but the message clear. This was once a woman, and now only a symbol. What do we do with that kind of devotion? Do we call it sacred? Or do we call it sacrifice? And what happens when devotion is demanded, not given? Sati was never just about love. It was about purity, honor, fear, control. And yet, in that same land, there were voices, poets, reformers, women who said no, who chose life, who carried their stories forward. They are harder to find, but they are there, written between the flames. The fires of Sati have long gone out, but the ash remains, pressed into stone, scattered in rivers, buried in the dust. And so does the question, what kind of love asks you to disappear and calls it holy? The North Sea winds bite hard at Trelleborg. The longhouse stands again now, rebuilt, timber polished by modern hands. But the ground beneath it remembers something older, something the sagas only whisper. I walked the ramparts at dusk. The ring fortress lay open to the sky, its symmetry perfect, too perfect. Built not just for war, but for ritual in the center of the compound. Beneath what had once been a chieftain's hall, they found a circle of skulls, 9, human, placed with care, as if waiting. The sagas speak of Odin, All-Father, seeker of knowledge, bringer of war, but also a god who demanded sacrifice. He hung for 9 nights from the world tree, pierced by a spear, to gain wisdom, to steal the runes from the void. And in return, he asked the same of his followers. 9 lives, 9 blades, 9 days of blood. We found traces of fire pits, animal bones, tools made of iron and antler. But it was the skulls that held the story. All male, some young, none buried in the traditional way. These were not fallen warriors. These were offerings. In one socket, a bead still lodged, perhaps once part of a necklace, or a token given in final moments. The Vikings did not fear death. They sang to it, invited it to feast. But when death became offering, it took on a different shape. This was not just violence. It was a message, a call to the gods. And the gods, they believed, listened only when the blood was fresh. Ritual sacrifice was rare, but when it happened, it was precise, symbolic, a replication of myth. The Ninefold slaughter was not about cruelty. It was about symmetry, about aligning mortal hands with divine pattern. Some scholars argue this was a kingship rite, to seal power, to anoint a ruler in shadow. Others believe it marked the end of a cycle, a year of drought, a season of defeat, a desperate plea to tilt fate back into balance. I stood over the site, now covered in clean grass. Children played nearby, their laughter dancing on air once heavy with screams. And I felt it, that strange contradiction. Beauty wrapped in horror, devotion clothed in death. One runestone nearby bears no name, only a spiral of interlocking shapes, endless, like sacrifice itself. Trelleborg was a fortress, but it was also a temple, a place where power was fed not just with steel, but with blood. The skulls are in a museum now, labeled, lit by glass, safe, silent, but they once saw fire, once heard chants, once knew the chill of the northern wind as they waited to die. In the end, they were not victims, not in the eyes of those who took their lives. They were chosen, they were necessary, and as I left the site, the sky turned violet. A raven called once overhead. Just once, sharp, then gone. The old gods may have fallen quiet, but their altars remain, etched in soil, hidden beneath our feet. And in the places where myth once ruled, their stories still ask the question, what are we willing to give? To be remembered by something greater than ourselves. The wind has shifted, the fire has burned low, and the pages of my journal feel heavier now. Not from weight, but from what they carry. We walked through smoke and shadow, through fire pits and silent bogs. We stood where kings were buried with their slaves, where children were given to gods, where devotion was measured not in prayer, but in pain. These were not simply rituals. They were mirrors held up to humanity, reflecting what we become when we reach for the divine, when we fear the unknown, when we need something to blame or to believe in. And yet, there is beauty here, even in the horror, a strange kind of reverence, as if each sacrifice, each chant, each carved stone was a hand reaching through the darkness, asking to be remembered. Some of these people believed they were saving the world. Others were told they must. A few chose the flame. Most did not. But all of them left something behind. A mark, a scar, a warning. Now we carry their stories. Not to judge, not to excuse, but to understand. Because history does not whisper. It waits. And when we are quiet enough, when we dig deep enough, it speaks. Not in answers, but in echoes. And so the expedition continues. There are more paths to follow, more ruins to read, more questions buried beneath stone and soil. But for now, I close the journal. I look to the horizon, and I remind myself, the past is not gone. It is only buried, waiting, not to be mourned, but to be seen.